This is the very first time we've ever had a hybrid webinar from INTALiNC. So welcome to the people in the room. Thank you for joining us. There may be a few people might pop in once they found the room, because it's not the easiest place to find in the world, is it? Welcome to all of our attendees online. We're still letting a few people in. This is the fourth session of our webinar series for this year from INTALiNC. And we're really lucky to have some people here in person to be on the panel. So they'll introduce themselves in good time. And we've also got a couple of panelists online as well. Hopefully we will manage all of this tech well, and you'll have a really great experience. So for me, I'll hand over to Tim Schwanen, who's going to chair the meeting.
Thank you very much, Karen, and welcome all at this final seminar of the series of 4 that we've done on the theme of decolonising transport planning. What are the implications for transport poverty? And we started with this series in the middle of May, where we had our first seminar where we kind of introduced this whole theme of decolonisation and what that means for research and planning with regards to transport policy. We had 3 lovely presentations who sort of brought out different aspects of this. We then had a separate session 2 weeks later on popular transport, perhaps better known as informal transport, and how sort of you look at that through a lens of decolonial transport planning and research. And then we focused on questions of marginalization, gender, and decolonisation. And we had various presentations focusing on gender mobilities and also a focus on disability in that session. And I think we had 9 really good presentations and very rich discussion around them. And if I was to sort of provide a very high level synthesis from my situated perspective, I think 3 points stood out for me in that regard. So first of all is that I think decolonial research on transport poverty is really something that's quite novel still. It stands in it's really in its infancy, which is good in many ways because it gives us a lot of freedom, and there isn't yet a clear set of standards with regards to concepts, theory, or methods. I think we'll see more of that emerge as things progress, but at the moment, I think people are sort of really trying to find their feet with this topic and trying to sort of find their way around and experimenting with different ways of tackling this question. I do think that research is really beginning to challenge some of the assumptions and norms that are taken for granted in the wider transport research and transport planning community. And we've seen actually quite some good examples of that over those 3 earlier sessions. With regards to transport needs, for instance, where various speakers have really been challenging this idea that what, for instance, globally operating NGOs and development organizations are telling countries around the world what they might need and what types of, for instance, electric BRT systems they might have. And I think that's a really, really useful thing. So we're kind of seeing it, people opening up questions about what changes are really desired in cities and peripheral and sort of peri-urban settings in Africa, Asia, and also Latin America. I think we've seen some very interesting ideas about how you can think about travel behavior differently, and also how we can think about disadvantage and informality in different ways. And I think once the seminar series is completed, all 4 seminars will appear on the INTALiNC website or the YouTube channel, and people can sort of go back and sort of find this out for themselves if they want to. I do also think, however, that the research that we've been talking and that we've been presenting is disproportionately still undertaken by scholars from and in European universities. And actually, sort of in the discussions that Karen, Emma, and I have had about sort of finding speakers the first names we always came up with were with sort of people based in mostly Europe. And I think that raises questions about how this agenda is being taken forward from here. So I think this is a,
Can I just interrupt to say
Sure.
also, it seems like the inequalities issues are being talked at in one place and the transport colony, decolonisation in another place, not necessarily very well woven together.
Yes, absolutely, and I think that is one of the things that we really need to work on. I think that session that we had on marginalisation and gender started doing that, but I think there is a need for much more of that. So I think that's kind of where we are at this level, and this is also a good moment to start introducing and sort of giving opening up the floor to our panelists, because we've got a very esteemed panel here today, and I will just start sort of on my right hand side for you left on the screen, and ask people to quickly introduce themselves, their background, and then sort of if they could briefly talk to the question that we got on the slide: what's your professional experience with regard to decolonisation in relation to transport poverty? Winnie, can we start with you, please?
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm Winnie Mitullah. I'm based at the Institute for Development Studies, University of Nairobi. My background is political science, but in recent times, some people think I'm a planner, some people think I'm an engineer, some people think I'm a geographer. But this is because I'm based in an institute, which is a multidisciplinary institute. We work in teams. So when we work in teams, I would always handle the areas of institutions, governance, and policy, and the rest can handle other components. So taking this topic is quite an interesting topic. And for some of us who come from the South, decolonization or colonial was always branded with so many other fixations. So when you talk about decolonizing transport in the year 2024, I'm left with a lot of questions about what is then decolonization, because we are in the context of globalization. And I think the deficit or the weakness that one sees that might want to argue for decolonization in the South is more to do with probably issues of data and knowledge being generated locally. But even when you generate knowledge locally, that knowledge has to be blended with global experiences. So in my perspective, I see the concept decolonization of transport planning or poverty is a good concept, but it has to be used with a lot of caution. If you place it into the framework that how we always understood colonization and decolonization, then you miss the point. It's more of how do we balance, are we able, for example, scholars from the South, to work with our government so that we are able to generate new knowledge, and how does that new knowledge blend with the global experiences that we have? And sometimes scholars debate about it's the person undertaking the research, for example, is it the South or the North? And is it that when a Northerner does research, we'll have a different outcome in the South or not? But it's not necessarily that way. I think what comes out is a blend. I like the way Tim puts it, that it's very much at an infancy stage where when I get people who are fixed about we need to decolonize, and I want to struggle with what do we need to decolonize? Is it that we need to collect more information and data and ground our studies and perspectives locally? But even when we do, we will still have some methodologies and concepts that cut across. But the blending is the issue and the critical question, in my perspective, that we have to deal with. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a great opener, and I'm sure we will return to some of these issues later. Let's move to our second guest today, Daniel Oviedo from UCL. Daniel, please.
Thanks, Tim. Well, Daniel Oviedo here, Associate Professor in University College London, and I'm based at the Development Planning Unit of UCL, with part of the Bartlett, the Faculty of the Built Environment. And it's an interesting place to be, especially when we speak about colonization and decolonization, because we started at the Institute for Tropical Planning, similar to the way that it was thought about tropical medicine as something that happens differently in other parts of the globe, particularly in the global south. So I'm Colombian. I'm originally born, raised, and trained in Colombia as an engineer. So different to Winnie. Now people think that I'm a geographer, a planner, or sometimes a sociologist. I always like to call myself a civilized engineer, rather than a civil engineer. Partly because my training has sort of transitioned from transport engineering to transport planning to development planning, which is a completely different way of seeing what planning itself is, and sort of blends it with this idea, with the notions that we get from development studies. My experience, I've always kept a foot in Latin America, particularly in Colombia, but also in many other countries in the region. Partly because in the work that I've been doing with many of my colleagues, and I think that's one initial part that I want to raise in the context of my experience, is that you will never see a paper, almost never will see a paper when I'm writing on my own. And I've always worked with my colleagues who are based in the context where we're working, because it's impossible to think about generating knowledge about transport, poverty, inequalities, or health, and its impacts on health, without that local expertise, that local knowledge, and in many cases without that being driven from there. So I see myself, and most of my work is between Latin American cities and sub-Saharan African cities. That's where I have built my career on. I see myself as sort of an insider. Like I managed to infiltrate the global institutions with very much a thinking that emerges from the problems of the South. So coming from an empirical perspective and a genuine concern about the many inequalities, the many structural inequalities that we face, initially in Latin American cities, where precisely not only the colonial model, but actually the inherited planning systems that we got and that I was trained in as an engineer continue perpetuating the issues that we're facing. So some of the things that I have started looking at is the role of the BRT and this idea of best practice, even if they're coming from the South, because BRTs, they really became popular when they started working in Latin American cities. But today, looking at it from a different perspective, it has always been about that notion of solving the problem of mobility, right? And by solving the problem of mobility, we never question that every opportunity was concentrated in the same area. So we put connectivity over connectivity over connectivity and keep pushing the poor towards the peripheries, which is what Tim was alluding to earlier. And that, of course, if we sum it out over decades of the same system of planning, of the same systems for prioritization of a very limited capital investment, and over decades of the same organizations, which I'm not going to be named, but you know what I'm talking about, that are pouring funding, that are parachuting with consultants. That's probably not the case today, and that's something else that we need to recognize. And as Winnie was saying, is that overall, I think that it is in its infancy when we think about the discussion about decolonization, but the knowledge is very rich, and perhaps one of the problems is not so much that the knowledge is not as rich, but it's not as visible.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we have learned in looking at walking and walkability research, and that came very, very clearly in one recent review of the global literature, is that when you saw who were the scholars writing about walking in Africa, the majority were European. Those were the ones who were having the citations, but it's not that there were no research from African scholars or from local scholars, it's that they were not yet cited. So we tend to give more priority to a research that says this is walkability, and it says in the title, a model for walkability based on the city of Ghent, which has tens of thousands of people, and then we ignore the ones with the millions. So I think we also need to challenge the hegemony of some of that in the global citation system.
Agree.
Thank you. That was really good. Let's move to our online panelists. Gina Porter is with us today. Gina, would you mind going next, please?
Okay, hi. Yeah, that's very interesting. I think I would start by saying that, of course, I started my professional academic career in Africa, in Nigeria. I worked for 10 years, lived for 10 years in Nigeria, worked in Nigerian universities, and I think that this has given me a totally different entree into so many of these issues around decolonisation, because I was a local employee. I wasn't somebody who was just brought in from the north. And I understood from a personal experience how tough it was working in that context with library limitations and so on. And what I did learn was that actually you just needed to get out into the field and really look at what was happening. That really you need to learn from the field, and that a lot of the sort of standard Northern theory that I'd come across as an undergraduate didn't really seem to apply terribly well. And therefore, I think that's really made me move. So I very much moved into working with communities, with peer research, and so on. I think the other thing I would say is my disciplinary background is geography, anthropology. But of course, academic disciplines are very much a Western invention. It can be a straitjacket. And so I would say that interdisciplinarity is really crucial when you're looking at understanding what's happening and understanding inequalities and how the way, precarities shape whatever is going on. And you won't understand that from just one discipline. You've got to have that broad perspective. I suppose, I think that's probably enough.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Gina. We move on to SG, please.
Yeah, thank you. It's been quite interesting. Odewumi SG, S being Samuel and G being Badebo. By background, I'm a geographer. Though I've moved a bit, taught me to GIS at master's level, but in the final degree was in transport. And I must say that I was just doing my normal geography research, GIS, until I got infected with INTALiNC. And parents, decolonization, because we have always been discussing decolonization in the context of politics, in the context of economics. I've really never looked at it as, the nexus between that transport and port. Since my association, since we've started Ghana, Bangladesh, and we've been all over the world, it has now generated a whole lot of concern for me, and that is to say that the interest, I'm not alone, the interest in the research of poverty and transport decolonization is not exciting, as Oviedo said. It's not an exciting thing in the South. So, but as I said now, I now picked it up, and that made me into an evangelist of some sort, trying to work on the mindset. Advocacy is now my major, because you really have to work your colleague. So even research into this area, get more interested, researching the mindset issues around decolonizing transport, which many people will not otherwise think of. Then the funding flow. This is a research. What are the supporting funds from all over the world? Where are they diverted to? Because it is we say who pays the piper dictate the tune. So the tune of development in transport is dictated by the form. Even when proposals are requested from the north, it is mostly people write for that proposal in order to draw from that fund, not because they are excited about the topic. So the policy, that's where I'm really, because without affecting the policy, you will not be able to do much on your own. We have been able to push the establishment of School of Transport, where I was the dean for so many years. Then we have been able to push for the policy on transport. The first time in the country, since my last presentation on this platform, we've been pushing that we need to have a policy on transport where we can inject the thinking on decolonization into the document to guide the politicians and policy implementers. Then the last, even the technology of transport, how we can adapt and adopt local people. Then spatial disparity, rural, urban. These are some of the inequalities in the situation. When we get into the topic, I will expatiate more on some of these things.
Thank you, SG. Karen.
Okay, so I don't know what to add to all of that. I'm very impressed with this discussion already. It's fantastic. I do think what Gina's saying about the way in which you come at the discipline, and because I came at the discipline from a social science perspective, I was never really interested in transport or planning or urbanisation or any of those things. I was always first interested in inequalities. And then when I saw that transport as a discipline everywhere, the whole worldwide, did not think about that. They did not think about, even though everyone was talking about the fact that transport was an enabler of other things, and an enabler of activities and a merit good and all of these things. There was never any question when I started out about who got that merit good and who did not get that merit good and what the social consequences of not having that merit good were. And I never, ever, in fact, I can remember doing in my social sciences degree development studies, and then teaching me that there were these 5 stages of development, by so, and these countries were at stage 1, and I can remember thinking to myself, that doesn't seem right to me. And we're going to go in and we're going to tell them how they're going to reorganize their economy through the IMF, and we're going to do this. And I thought to myself, I don't want anything to do with this development study stuff. It's disgusting. It's really, really bad. And so for a really long time, I avoided getting involved in questions of transport inequality in global south or developing context, whatever, because I just felt like I didn't want to be doing unto others what we were already doing wrong unto ourselves, right? And so who was I to be going and telling some other country what to be done? But then it so transpired that South Africa did its first survey of the whole population, including the previously excluded Black populations and coloured populations in South Africa, first transport survey after apartheid, and something like 85% of the population said that they couldn't participate in basic activities such as employment and education because of a lack of transport or transport affordability issues or being able to actually physically get places, accessibility issues. And because we'd done the transport and social exclusion study in Britain, and I know I don't want to pop in history, but basically I suddenly felt like, okay, maybe I could say something to that agenda, to the policymakers there to get it on the table. And I sort of agree with what SG said, is that increasingly I find that the utility of being a white global north researcher, in a white global north institution, amongst all the colonizing types of research that's put out there by our own country, such as the Global Challenges Research Fund, which in and of itself was a colonized sort of way of knowledge exchange. And for me, the one thing that is useful, though, is to play this advocacy role, to be able to be there and to be able, because you're seen as important in some way, because you're a white visiting professor or whatever, to be able to go and talk to people that maybe other academics in the countries that I go to visit, like when I went to visit with you, Winnie, or whatever, we can get an ear of someone. We might just manage to get the ear of somebody who can do something that actually the local people have been banging the door at for ages and not being able to get there. So increasingly, that's what I see, but I also agree with everything that everyone said about it's having to work with people locally, not necessarily to fly in and out, and recognise the value of the local team, which is very, very much what INTALiNC is all about. It's why it's a network. It's why we don't work on developing countries, but with academics in those places to try and come up with a collaborative agenda. And colonisation, decolonisation, I don't know, Winnie, I don't know whether decolonisation is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm sure I don't really know what it means yet. So at least this is part of that discussion. Thank you for letting me have my say, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you. So before we continue, I would want to sort of stress, particularly for our online audience, if you have any thoughts that you would like to share, please use the comment, the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and we can, I see them and I will feed them into the discussion, and perhaps, Emma, you can put up the comments already. We've got one already that's by Meleki that we'll return to, but please do feed them to us so that we can incorporate them into the discussion. So I think it's both Winnie and Karen are sort of coming back to the question, okay, what is decolonisation in this context? And I think that's a very important question. And I would say that actually as a community, transport research comes to this terribly late. We're sort of really,
Yes,
the curve is way miles ahead of us. I think we can actually learn a lot from what has happened in other research fields.
yeah,
Urban studies, environmental studies, energy studies. I think they're all ahead of us. But if you look at kind of the more wider social science literature around decolonisation, which as a term I don't really like. I think it's actually quite problematic. It's just that it's so easy to use. Any of the alternatives takes many more words. But what this comes down to, decolonisation or decolonial research, is really about sort of reframing, reworking the kinds of knowledges that we use and that we generate. So there are issues here about concepts, there are issues about theory, there are lots of issues about methods, and we've already talked about that. And the question of not doing research on but with is key to that. So there's a lot about participatory methods, for instance.
and can I just say also, just bringing out what Gina said, even beyond that, this idea of the peer-to-peer, which is another new way of doing things. So it's not even researchers researching on, but people researching with each other.
It's new for us, but as Tim was saying, it's something that has been applied for a while, many years.
Yeah, by Gina, for years and years and years.
So then there's also in that wider literature the question about, okay, that there is a kind of built-in assumption that decolonial research practice explicitly works towards transformation. Transformation, addressing questions of inequality, of justice, of sort of colonial or neo-colonial systems that exist in the broader sense. So there is a very much, I don't really like the term impact either, but that is kind of built into that wider agenda. So because of these kinds of broader considerations, I sort of put together a set of questions as a heuristic for the further discussion that you see here on the slide. And again, please, audience, do feed us your thoughts. So you see 5 questions. We're not going to do them one by one. I think we'll start with the first one, and then we'll probably move through the others in various ways. But I think if we accept that decolonization of transport research and planning is about different ways of doing research with different concepts, different theories that do not generalize from the very narrow North American or Western European experience, then is that something that we need to do more of, given the challenges that we'll inevitably face, given that the mainstream transport research and planning is sort of very strongly wedded to particular notions of what a transport system is, what it should look like, what behavior is, and what kind of is seen as normal behavior. So is this an agenda that we should continue? And if so, what are the key next steps for that to happen? Any of the panelists who would like to reflect on that question, that set of questions?
I will. I think it's about setting an agenda. It's really about setting an agenda, because if you look at the southern countries, the former colonies, you find that there is lack of data. And the municipality, the governments don't invest much in research. So when research comes from agenda set elsewhere, like right now, when you see everybody's running towards BRT and you have the paratransits, and sometimes we say, if we build from the paratransits, we might get there still, but we want to build from what we don't know. So that disruption out of a context which is not familiar, lack of data. And the way I see it is that we can play a role, especially scholars, if only our countries can tap into higher learning institutions. In recent years, there is a lot of debate about how the South taps into higher learning institutions, and you can't tap without investing into them. First, you have to invest. Like my country, Kenya, I think they put something like 2% of the national budget. That's nothing. Yeah. It's obviously nothing. It can't do much. So for the South to do some research, you rely on partnerships and collaborations. And in those collaborations, they come in different setups. There are some that actually think together and you set the agenda together, very much focusing on the South. But you also have some that come ready and only need collaborators on a ready set agenda. That's another type that will not get you to where you want to be. So then there are also what we call national commitments, which countries commit. Like right now, we are talking about compact planning. I mean, it's a good concept, but you need to really domesticate that concept and understand where you are for you to really embed it. But these are prisms that we pick from the global, and then we struggle to implement them. And yet, the best way would be, what's our package? What's the local agenda, research agenda for the local scholars and teams? So I think that missing out in terms of, and also the prioritization of planning. I don't think transport planning in earlier days was given a priority. It's right now that transport planning is becoming something to think about. It was taken for granted, and even we talk about pre-colonial or colonial time. Colonial time, if you want to look at marginalization and how transport was better. This is the reality. Because first of all, the colonial team was planning for what they need. And they knew where people stayed, that's what they planned for. The rest they assumed was a balance and the leftover. So when decolonization happens and we are into the context of planning for ourselves, you find that the people that were marginalized remain marginalized. Yeah. So it's like our new agenda should have been on informality, on paratransit, on those that the 80% that were assigned. But that's not what we did. A lot of teams, countries continued with the previous, emphasis on transport planning was continuing the way it has always been. In recent times, there is a lot of change, and God rest Watson's soul, Vanessa and her planning school and what she initiated was really great. And that is where the debates about Africa and can we rethink planning again came on table. And it's not picking up at local context. It's very minimal. It's happening, but very, very minimal. So I think overall, the debate falls under critical thinking, yes. But when it comes to transport, we are still really getting to that critical thinking of rebooting the whole system. Good. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Daniel would like to add his thoughts too.
I'm going to build on what Winnie said, which I completely agree. I mean, we need to set an agenda, but I think we also need to set like equal partnerships across sort of global north and south. It's something that is very difficult to deny, is that if we want to do some large-scale research, we're going to have to tap into funds that are coming from global organizations or from global north countries. Like the level of funding that is available in a country like Colombia or in Sierra Leone, where I have worked, is very limited for research. And one of the issues is, as Winnie was saying earlier very clearly, is that it's not the same, and I think SG also mentioned it, it's not the same to come with a ready-made argument, this is what we're going to study, and this is what you're going to help us with, than sitting down and say, there is this opportunity, what can we do together about? And it needs to come in sort of leveling the playground from the beginning. Even if the proposal is not successful, in itself, doing the effort together and building the proposal is going to create that capacity. And it should be a way of leveraging those sort of resources from the global north in a different way. So that's probably something that needs to permeate as well the funding system itself. So we are able to also help co-producing those agendas that are being funded. Because in many cases, especially when we look at national funds, they tend to respond to the immediate needs of that country in terms of trade, in terms of whatever politics are imperating at the moment. But the other thing that I want to say is that it's true, of course, that there are many gaps in evidence, but those gaps in evidence should be contested from not only from research and research that shows that different methods are possible. So thinking outside of sort of those dominating disciplines that tend to sort of be the ones taken seriously in our context in the global south. So in many local authorities, if you're not coming with a very sophisticated model and lots of statistics, nobody's going to take you seriously. And that's when coming as a white academic from a white institution in the global north might give more weight to that evidence. So we did qualitative work, we did participatory work, we did ethnography, and this is what we're finding. Many times the local scholars in the social sciences are not taken seriously in planning circles, but if they say, and that's unfortunate, but it's something that we can probably leverage in, is what happens when there are these partnerships used to sort of give weight to that evidence. And the third thing that I wanted to say is regarding capacity is that we cannot decolonize research without decolonizing teaching. So we need to challenge as well those same methods that we have been teaching young practitioners who are going to go and repeat the same ways of thinking about infrastructure, of thinking about service provision, of thinking about informality and poverty, or not thinking about them at all, right? So these experiences where you have someone that is sitting in a computer making decisions or informing decisions without even setting a foot in the neighborhood that is going to be affected by an investment, a large investment in infrastructure, that cannot continue. And by using our partnerships as well to sort of embed research-based teaching more into the curricula of different disciplines that we know are going to go out to work in transport planning, in transport studies, that's something else that perhaps can be done to decolonize the practice.
Thank you, Daniel. Gina, SG, do you have anything? Yeah. Please.
Yes, thank you. Should we continue the research? Yes. If so, what are the next key steps? I think that has been touched that agenda setting is very important. The colonialists set their agenda and it worked for them. Resource extraction, administrative control, and trade facilitation. And they use transport to achieve. The issue of poverty was not on their mind. Now, so what do? We now have to, as Winnie said, set our own agenda. And for me, I have a clear vision of what these areas, the elements should be. We should do research to gather data for advocacy, for transport to be used to address poverty issues. And 4 key areas, or 5 might be of interest that I will mention. First of all, equitable distribution of the infrastructure is very important. That is, we collect data to show inequality between certain rural, urban regions and all that. Secondly, community involvement, the degree of community involvement in the design and implementation of the transportation project and design and planning. Then we have to collect data on sustainable models. What are the models that we know can easily, poor people in quote can easily get into, like in non-motorized, you assist them and they are able to be more effective in dealing with their own poverty. Then we also look at the cultural issues in order to bring them on board, this part of community participation. And of course, we have to collect data in our new research on environmental sustainability of the new model, the new paradigm that we want to. So for us, for me in Nigeria, and what we are doing now is researches that we address any of these key areas and we collect data so you can speak to it. Okay, you did 10 here, you did only 1 here, you not get these people involved there, and so on. So I think the answer is yes. And the key next step is to know what we want to achieve and identify elements of research, including the flow of funds, those funding agencies, are they funding, so that we can tell AFDB, that's African Development Bank, and Afrexim Bank, that look, don't continue to fund what was being funded by World Bank and IMF. Change your paradigm, those things you want to support. So and then this will, and the policy, generally the policy framework, what they should do. So I think I conclude by saying yes, we should continue by identifying the elements that we'll be addressing going forward. And for us, we need to use the data we collect in this research for advocacy.
Thank you. Wonderful. Gina, was there anything you wanted to add?
Just a quick thought. I am intrigued that about the way decolonial approaches are suddenly very much the fashion. You know, in the universities, there is a box ticking exercise going on. And I think we need to think very carefully about what we really want and what would be really productive. It's not quite so straightforward. And I think, you know, the points about decolonizing teaching, co-production, advocacy are all really important. But for us sitting in northern universities, we need to make sure that we're doing what's really important and what we as a community feel is important across globally, rather than what our universities are encouraging us to do.
That's an excellent point. And it kind of reminds me of a paper I read literally yesterday from someone in a British university who had, like some of us, received funding from the Global Challenges Research Fund, and the expectations that are built into that, and the expectations that our universities impose on us, and how that is restricting many of the things we would like to do, and how co-production sort of can mean very different things to different people in a university administration, to a funding agency, and to researchers who really want to work with local collaborators. In this case, I think it was actually in Uganda. And it's very important because, not least, the way our funding agencies impose all kinds of restrictions on the funding they give to partners abroad. I mean, we've had these issues with INTALiNC, which we're talking about peanuts in terms of the overall budget of the ESRC, but the hoops that Karen and Emma had to go through to disperse that money was ridiculous.
Oh,
And we've had the same,
Yeah.
because in our case, the ESRC imposes very rigid constraints on transparency and due diligence and sort of all kinds of bureaucratic practices that sort of are very British in their origin and that simply do not work in the same way in different parts of the world. So it's a really important point, Gina, that you're making, and it does mean we need to think very carefully about what it is that we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, academically, we could all be actually really wanting and collaborating in this way, in this very positive way, and our administrative structures are just actually sending out a completely different set of messages. It's not only just between universities, but when we try to work with NGO partners and other people on the ground, it makes it really difficult to pay people. And it's really difficult to pay for people's time and all of these other things. And it's this restrictions of the way in which funding is being allocated through the university systems, which in and of itself has got this non-trust basis. But I want to take it further than that, because I think, like, if I'm going to think about decolonisation as anything, part of it for me is that we have to deconstruct it. If we want to decolonise, we have to deconstruct what decolonisation means. So that deconstruction in its very self, for me, also asks the same thing about transport poverty. So I think a lot of the things that we've been doing through INTALiNC and through all of our different projects and work is to sort of really think, well, does it mean that you're transport poor because you have to walk? Isn't actually walking part of sustainable mobility? Does it mean that it's transport poverty because you rely on informal systems? Not necessarily. In fact, some of the informal systems that have sprung up in places like Soacha are the solution, right? You know, so it's, if we really try to, I think, go through that whole thing of, you know, what does transport poverty really mean when we suddenly transfer ourselves to the global south context, because it's not necessarily the same thing as not having a car or not having a private vehicle. It could mean something quite different, and quite often just be simply that overexposure to traffic and transport systems, you know. So more mobility is not necessarily the answer to transport poverty, right? Which is what we're seeing. And you've also talked about planning, and I think it pushes forward the integration between the transport mobilities and accessibility and housing and all of those other things, which really at the end of the day is quite often driving the problem even more than the lack of transport. So when we were hearing Ada the other day talking about her Turkish, you know, often it's where the housing is, and it's the housing problem that is driving the transport. Not always, but it's also driving the transport problem. So I think at the same time, we need to be thinking about what exactly, as we're deconstructing the idea of decolonisation, we should also be quite constantly questioning ourselves about what we mean by these other things, and the fact that that needs to be deconstructed as well. And so an idea that we need to have a think piece about this, or something that we begin with people on the ground talking about what we see as this, is a really great idea from one of the participants.
Yeah. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but I did think it's useful to, because the focus is really on transport poverty, and you haven't spoken about that as much. You just really started that. And I still think this is a very useful definition. You see it used a lot.
Oh, we missed number 5. The most important bit was about the ability to be able to affect and govern and change that system, and the participative aspect. It's a terrible definition. It's like, sorry, but it is all of those things, but the one important thing is missing. So you're allowed to criticize yourself, right?
You are. But I think you already touched sort of on this first point about lacking access to motorized transport, sort of that, sort of with the walking point is a very important. I just wanted to put this up so that we at least have a common basis to speak from.
But it must be said that this was what we were talking about, transport poverty, in the concept of the global north.
Yes,
right? This is what it is in the global north. Even then, I think there was the number 5 was missing, but it was like, okay, it was put up as a straw doll. Is this the same as what we mean? And I think it's not.
Yeah,
I think it's not the same.
So we have some comments in Ogachukwu says, I'm still confused about what this decolonisation of transport is all about. Can any of the panelists give us a hypothetical analogy as an example?
Of a colonized?
Gina, I don't want to put you on the spot, but because you've got so much of the influence from outside of transport, would you be able to put something on the ground for us there? Maybe not.
I think there is a lot of assumption about decolonization of transport. There is a lot of assumption that the planning, the planning that we've been doing with transport is wrong. So that's the first level. So if you look at what's happening and what was before, then you realize that the low income, the poor are moving a little bit away from access to the, economic opportunities. So that then becomes really, you can call it transport poverty, because somebody is not able to access opportunities because maybe they cannot afford transport or is far away from them. But if we were to plan in a way that, because if you look at colonial planning, a lot of people who are workers or poor were very close to their working opportunities.
Yeah.
If you are a domestic worker, you stayed within the compound of who you worked for. That's no longer there. The middle income don't have their workers staying with them. They stay way out there. So if you have a community of the poor in a particular suburb, you will find that they either have to just do their informal businesses locally because they can't look for work far away, but within vicinity, they can get work. So I think decolonizing transport as is being raised can be very difficult to understand in the current context. You can even dismiss it as you would like to. Whoever is asking that, you can dismiss the concept.
See, for me, it's very specific.
Yeah.
It is just simply these great big global organizations that externally impose systems, policies, funding, ideas from the top and from the outside on countries that don't necessarily need those systems, want those systems, but have to have them because it's the only form of funding they're ever going to get.
But they are able to also reject it.
Well, yeah, but they're
not
not.
always. I think
They can.
I think we have a problem as well of path dependency, and it's that
Yeah.
for a long time we have been doing the same over and over, and that same wasn't necessarily something that was homegrown. It was something that from the beginning was imported, at least in many.
Yeah. No.
In the post-war context, what tended to happen is that suddenly the World Bank was very interested in a specific type of growth and a specific type of sort of driving urbanization and planning. And that's what many of the people that ended up leading the top universities, the top ministries, the top areas that were making decisions were being trained to think about, or we are being sold consultants that weren't informed that process. So we're talking about, many decades before, but today we're trying to deal with the consequences of saying, can we reject that type of plan?
Yeah.
I guess that decolonizing is not necessarily saying the way that we're doing things doesn't work, although I do believe that the way that we have been doing things for a while hasn't worked. But it's being in a position of asking the question, does this work for us?
Critical.
Exactly.
Yeah, being critical.
I think Gina wants to.
Yeah, so sorry, we had SG first, and then I have Gaurav here, and then I have Gina. SG, please.
I was frozen.
So maybe Gina first.
Maybe we'll do Gaurav first.
Yeah, so I didn't want to come in between, but just wanted to think a bit more about decolonization. And if we turn it upside down, could we think about what is colonization, what is colonial in transport? And also because a lot of times we, if we want to be anything, we need to set the benchmark. What are those benchmarks? What are the colonial practices? Because it might be easier to put everything what World Bank does or what all these global institutions do in the bad light or negative light, right? But not all is negative. So something positive might be coming out of it also. So it's not just that side that everything what is coming from north is bad.
No.
It's not. Then the other thing is that how there are various terms. Colonial is just one term, but neoliberal, another term, capitalist, another term, imperialist, another term. So within all this, what is colonial? What is colonial and what is other? Because if we just keep merging these terms together, we kind of, I feel that we don't reach anywhere else. We just get entangled in terminology and.
Good point.
Yep, thank you. Gina.
Oh, just quickly, just to say, I don't think it's not also only about historical centers of knowledge production shaping everything. I think it's also a center periphery issue within countries globally, and that you've got to think about. There are different scales at which you need to think of decolonization occurring.
Good, yeah.
That is a very important point again. And one of the things that I observed with the Global Challenges Research Fund, that it was proposals that were successful, that got funded, were those that were working with what, according to global, i.e. Western standards, were seen as the best universities in those countries. And the project that I was involved in, we deliberately made that choice. We sort of thought, okay, we got 4 continents and we'll take one institute from each, and we'll take what is, according to some people in those contexts, the best institute. And in that sense, kind of make things work for us. And I mean, it worked, but it raised all these questions, for me at least, about, okay, what kinds of inequalities are we sort of perpetuating and even exacerbating through this program?
Gina makes a very interesting point, and is whether we should be speaking about decolonizing or just challenging the elites that are driving in every possible sphere, right? I mean, you just made a very significant point. Thing is that we tend to, in many contexts, what is going to happen is that to find the partners that can meet all of these bureaucratic requirements, they're probably very well endowed private universities. At least that's what happens in many contexts. So we're not really having a big impact in doing our research into, for example, public institutions, which tend to be the ones where the majority of those who cannot afford other type of higher education organization are going to be studying. So it's on the one hand, yes, it's who's doing the research. On the other is how can we make that research really permeate the knowledge systems in the countries that we're working in. And that probably brings another point, and is that when we think about elite knowledge is published in English. So if we're talking about Latin America, we're talking about Francophone Africa, we're talking about Asia in general, it's very difficult to either find or translate our knowledge and publish it in the local language, or that in our reviews of the literature, if you're in an Anglo-speaking university and you don't happen to know the language, you're not going to include the papers in Spanish in your bibliography. And that, of course, means also continue reinforcing that same way that this is the knowledge that is valuable. This is the elite knowledge that is worth citing.
But can I just, we still didn't have the hypothetical, right? So not hypothetical, but actual.
Analogy.
Which is that, for example, while I was recently in Ecuador, in the city of Quito, there's a big debate going on about the whole climate change electrification policies for public transport, because in Quito they don't believe that is the right way for them. They don't believe, and this might be for the rest of Latin America as well, I don't know, but they don't believe that they've got the resources to deliver it. They don't believe that they can scrap all of their public transport in an efficient, sustainable way. They don't think that they can deal with the batteries. They think because the altitude, there's all sorts of issues around the power generation of heavy goods vehicles. And they just don't think that is the best solution as a local solution for decarbonisation. Right, and there might be other alternatives that are not being explored, like hydrogen but because of the obsession with electrification across the whole of the global climate change agenda, that is a colonized way of dealing with it. and they would prefer a non-colonized way, a more locally appropriate solution. So that would be just like, for me, a way to describe the type of thing that happens in a lot of other areas.
When you talk about that, Karen, it makes me think, in recent years, sometimes I ask about literature
Yeah,
and say, could literature be the problem?
yeah, sometimes,
Because every one of us sends students to read.
yeah.
And people come to learn, but they have to read and identify different trends of thought. Yeah, that is the premise of training. You have to read.
In order to
Get the
criticize it,
difference, yeah. And yet the reading that is available is very much colonized, you know?
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, you are a planner, you are out there to plan, and all the friends are really not the right friends.
Yeah.
So I really don't know how we handle literature. It's important, and we know that is the core of knowledge.
Yeah.
But when we talk about critical thinking, I question about how we handle literature. I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good point. We may come back to that.
I think it's just back.
Let's use that.
Yes. SG, you wanted to say something before you sort of frozen our screens. Would you like to come in, please?
It's still frozen, I think.
Wow.
He's frozen again.
Oh,
He'll come back.
he'll come back. He'll be
He'll
back.
come back. And sort of,
Any more questions?
yeah, we do have a question sort of that goes back to this point about what is decolonization. And this is a question by Tony Plum. Apologies if I mispronounce your name. It's a little bit further up, Emma, on the so people can see. It's long, but I'll try to summarize. He suggests that he asked whether decolonization is not a subset of a question about who has control over transport. And he raises the point about internal and external colonialism, but in a slightly different way than Gina did. Because he goes on to say, local bus and truck operators collude to form potential colonization of transport. Most forms of local informal transport operate forms of internal control that take the form of internal colonization of their wider communities. Can the absence of transport planning for walkers be seen as part of the lack of consideration of internal and external colonial influences? It's quite a bit to unpack there. Anyone on the panel would like to reflect on some of the points that Tony has made?
Well, just saying something very quickly is that it's all about power, right? And sort of challenging the structures of power and influence. In many cases, those sort of, I mean, if we see it at the most macro level, especially in passenger transport, that elite or that power has come associated with wealth, with economic production, and sort of however we can grow, that's what is going to get priority, and whatever can get more votes. In this case, it could be the taxi union, or it could be the private vehicle owner. Those are the ones who are influencing. So I think Tony's point, it goes towards sort of challenging different ways of power, and sort of who gets invisibilized in the process of prioritizing that influence. And that, of course, can operate from the global to the very local neighborhood level, as it was being raised.
And because there's so much issue around governance, Winnie and I were talking yesterday about the fact that this whole thing about local partnerships and governance and the strength of the sustainable development goals, which seem to be forgotten around 17, you know, the institutional side of things within transport, that's very apparent. And because of these whole, the sort of corruption that goes on within the spending, within the governments, with who's allocated, with who's allowed to bid for projects, and then who runs them, that in itself needs unpacking. And that's not necessarily a colonial system that's going on. That's a corrupt internal system that's going on.
Can I make a one sentence point? Is that one of the many problems that we have seen in sort of recent research is that we tend to treat transport as apolitical, and transport is the most political thing.
Yeah.
And we don't address the politics of transport.
It's true.
Many people don't, some people do.
Then
There's actually, I know this is a very northern journal, but the Journal of the American Planning Association has now finally published a piece that explicitly argues that automobility in the US is deeply political.
Mm.
It's a piece by Jennifer Kent from Melbourne. It's just a moment. So there is hope, and we do see things change.
She's not an American, is she?
She's Australian.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure it would come from their own groan. But I'd like to go, that Gina was talking about also this whole thing about the focus of different the place and the spatial. And I think that's also true, is that one of the things that's happened is that we've got this sort of global cities. And if you're not a global city, i.e. a capital city, so Nairobi's all over, everywhere, right? As an example, isn't it? It's always being drawn up as an example. You hear the same cities, Kampala, again and again and again. But what you don't get. So as soon as we started dealing with, I can see Regina's online here, as soon as we started dealing with Cape Coast and Cape Coast University, with which Gina's also highly familiar, is a different scenario altogether. There is no public transport. There is nothing. There is just the trotros and people walking and what have you. So it's like, and those cities are not even there's no data.
So what is
They're not.
transport?
Yeah, exactly. So it becomes a different thing when you're thinking outside the centre cities, and we tend to collaborate with those big universities that are also in the central cities. Gina might have something to say about that on this. I don't know.
Yeah, and even when we focus on the big cities, we work with a very limited conception of what the urban is.
Yeah.
And typically don't focus on the peri-urban zones around the cities where a lot of the developments are happening.
Or even with Winnie Sambu, that was at the last section with the marginalisation, there is an interconnectivity with the rural areas because of food and marketing and all of these other things. And then all of a sudden the tricycles are not allowed in the city anymore. So where does the market goods come? So there is this interconnectivity that I think, as an urban institute, Manchester Urban Institute, we need to accept as well, that you can't just separate out the rural.
Yeah, I think in recent times there is a lot of, we are beginning to see the metropolitan approach, which is a good thing. And the country is beginning to struggle to figure out how transport should work, which is a good thing. Even my city, Nairobi, you have now an authority that looks beyond just the inner city. Because most of these people we are talking about, the poor and the marginalized, are out there. They're almost in the next suburb.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to get the resources still remain at the center in terms of opportunities, which they need to move. As much as we're talking about access and making everything accessible, we are still to achieve that goal of accessibility versus mobility. And the frame of reference of planning is still mobility. And sometimes when they argue with us and say that, well, this is a motorway, this is the highway. Then we ask, what do you mean by highway? It's an 8-lane highway passing in front of my university, which is right at the city. So why would it be a highway? Right at the center. Exactly. Why not 2-way or 1-way? And these are really issues that is all about how you conceptualize transport and who you prioritize. Yeah. Whether you are prioritizing those who are walking, those who are struggling, or whether you are prioritizing speed and those who are cars and parking.
The rigid, the sort of steps, like minimum standards, rigid prescriptive ways in which a road will be this wide and it will have this many things on it if it's in this area. It's also problematic from that point of view, right?
Yeah, quite. It is. But sometimes you just wonder, who is this planner who will encourage an 8-lane in front of a university which has 4,000 people crossing every time? I mean, it's just, you can't conceptualize it. And this happened not a long time ago, 3-4 years ago, putting an 8-lane, moving it from 2-way to 8-lane. And then we just can't cross into the city.
Yeah.
Then we get some flyover, which is not convenient to us, but convenient to cars. So I think the prisms of planning, I don't even think that is decolonizing that will get you out of that. That is not in the terrain of decolonization at all. It's just poor planning.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's it.
XG is back and has raised his hand.
Oh,
Yes. It's a pity the hotel internet just went down and I had to now use my phone to get back. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Now, I
no
just wanted
problem.
to address, Dr. Guma's question of hypothetical case to explain the colonization issue. It's not even an hypothetical case. She will recall that the planning paradigm of the colonial masters in Nigeria, which I've mentioned, are one, resource extraction, administrative control, trade facilitation. That is the colonial concept, which served them very well. And that went into, right from the time I was reading geography in the secondary school, I realized that, for instance, they will say the only reason you give road to the rural area is so that they will bring the agri products to the city and you will take finished product. It was in my head for a long time until there was a massive research that indicated that rural people, 80% of their mobility needs is within the rural area. They want to go to school in the rural area. They want to go to church or their mosque. They want to do their parties, their weddings, their ceremonies, their social, everything they want to do. 80% of their mobility. So whereas the thinking is, look, 80% of the reason why we are giving you this road is because we want to bring agricultural products to the cities, and we will give you finished products like salt, like Maggi Cube, and all that. So, and you will recall that the only reason I insisted on teaching rural transport for postgraduate students is that all the chairmen of local government, of people who are policymakers, they need to be reorientated that, look, these people want their own lives. You are not just giving them road for them to bring agricultural product for you to feed in the cities. Such inequality is embedded in the paradigm we are operating, and it is the paradigm of the colonial masters, which suits them. As I repeat, they want extraction, bring gold, bring this thing to the shore, and they make the transport network. We mentioned the Tafe, Mori, and Gold, the model that appeared, the template that appeared in West Africa of how transportation grew. So, and that is what we have been operating. We have been obeying this format that, look, let this road go to this area to bring this to the city. So that is the inequality, and it brings poverty to the people in the rural area. Then inequality of infrastructural development. Look at Lagos. Look at the money spent on Badagry and Marina Express. Billions and billions funded by the World Bank, which serves no useful purpose, rather than doing some internal roads in Lagos City. So a lot of shift in the orientation of how we plan the city. So the Badagry Road passes in front of Latsu. If you know me, you know, I don't need to tell you the amount of money that the Lagos state government has wasted on that, rather than do easy, equitable, something that the community can even be part of management. We did a meeting with the local transport union, and you said that if they are ready to work, we are ready to work with them, because they came to us to join them in influencing things, how to make transportation better. So that is an example that is not hypothetical. It is real that the present planning system promotes poverty, promotes inequality in infrastructural distribution. It does not involve the community in the planning. We take roads that goes to the chief's house, to the chairman of local government, to the governor's village, not to serve the people in the rural area. So those are the things that then those things that do not promote environmental sustainability. Is Lagos promoting non-motorized transport? Yes, on the paper they are saying it. But are those infrastructural design? Do they promote pedestrian walk? Do they promote bicycling in the city of Lagos? So it's not that what we are saying, and all of these, they accentuate poverty of the pure people. because their mobility are affected in all ways.
Thank you. What you're saying reminds me of something I was reading on the way to Manchester today, which was about cities in India, actually, where you see that, and this is a broader piece around mobility in later life, where you see that Indian cities have all signed up to promote active aging and inclusive aging. But then if you see what they actually do is very much focused on trying to mitigate congestion by building more roads. So I think we've heard wonderful things about African cities, about Latin American cities. We haven't spoken as much about South Asia or Southeast Asia. We do have people in the audience who have expertise in that area. I was just wondering if maybe one or two of them would like to come in and say something. Maybe Tanu. I don't want to put people on the spot, but if you do feel it's useful to sort of reflect on kind of the Asian experience, that please do feel free to come in.
Thanks, Tim. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, I would just like to say, and thanks for a great session. A lot of very relevant points for Asia was made as well. But I would just like to say that on practical terms, there is a big gap between the research community talking to each other and when the research community communicates with the others, like the practitioners and people working on ground. I've recently done a study where I was attending workshops with practitioners in Mongolia, in Nepal, and in Azerbaijan. And there was a complete disconnect in actually what I was saying and what they were listening and they were expecting to listen. There's a lot of focus, a lot of discussions on electric cars, and that is the next thing to do. So if you deviate from that, you are actually looked down upon. You're talking about walking, bicycling, public transport. These are boring, unsexy, uncool topics. You know, you need to give us examples of something in the league of hyperloops and at least electric cars. And that is deeply problematic because then we are just, repeating the mistakes we have made forever, whether you call it under or you discuss it under decolonization or planning mistakes or just an over obsession with technology. Yeah. And this is deeply problematic. So I think we need to just keep engaging with a lot of institutes or organizations who can facilitate more discussions with on-ground people. And this work I was doing was for a UN organization. And even UN, though they are invested in, of course, the SDGs and inclusive transport, they are also very much bought in by the electric policies. They're also going heavily in electric vehicle policy and electric cars and all. So I think we somehow need to keep repeating and emphasizing, however repetitive that sounds to us. I mean, when I listen to myself, I feel like, God, I have said this thing 1,001 times. Like, why am I saying it? But then again, I meet people who have never heard it. So in Mongolia, when I was discussing inclusive transport, the feedback I got from a very senior staff at the ministry, he told me, Thanu, this is the first time I've thought about inclusive transport in such a broad way, because I thought providing universal design was inclusive transport and that's enough. We provide ramps on buses and that's inclusive transport and my job is done. Yeah. And that sort of hegemony of simplicity needs to be broken. It's not that simple. It's very layered, and I think we need to keep engaging. And also, I don't know how to manage, and this was taken up by many of you, how to manage disconnecting, getting research funding and doing the real job. Because my research funding is dependent on doing something, producing high-level articles, doing a lot of technical analysis.
That is academic.
Exactly, and actually working on ground and getting just to talk to people, and so there is a disconnect, and I think we just need to keep working on it, but also be aware that we are doing the right kind of work. So I try to also sensitize whenever I can my students and also focus a lot on training young people to think on inclusive transport, not just technical transport, not just transport modeling, which is so fascinating. I mean, you produce numbers and it's such a statusful job. And when you talk about focus groups, it's such a low status job. No, not really. So I think like creating a balance between these very different kind of ways of thinking, sectors, discussing ways of interacting with different kinds of people, that should be taken on board in sync with whatever was said before. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. That was sort of a great set of comments that resonated very clearly here in the room and also online. I think Gareth would like to respond.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Tanu said. A similar thing I have also noticed. I work mostly in South Asia context, and it's this kind of hegemony which exists locally also, right? Of people who actually drive the policy at the local level, whether they are consultants, whether they are unfortunately researchers or other people. And it brings me back to the previous question where we were talking about working with the local community. But at the same time, if you face such problems, are you a colonial scholar because you are going from a global north institution with some agenda, a set agenda, where you want to make transport more inclusive, and you are trying to actually tell them that the way to make transport more inclusive is to not look at automobility and look beyond automobility, look at other things. But at the local level, the knowledge is predominantly that we have to think of the electric vehicles, we have to think of all these things, and we cannot talk about anything else. So how do we like negotiate these kind of conflicts when we go to the field? Is there a way?
I think that's really, really true as well, because so many southeastern cities have got huge air quality problems as well. So you're in this situation where electrification seems to also solve that health issue, right? So that's like almost probably number one priority. And it seems like you're going to get two go. So yeah, I think that is really a big issue. You're right. I don't have an answer. I just agree.
So I have one question that we haven't discussed, and then I sort of suggest that we sort of give the panelists one final opportunity to say something, and we can wrap up by 4 UK time. And this is a question from Maria, who's originally from Ecuador but lives in Germany. And she writes, I'm curious what you think about the rule that research should be neutral and apolitical, especially if topics such as gender, equity, decolonization, climate change are strongly political. How can we deal with this in our research?
I've got very simple.
Karen, I was going to ask you first.
I don't think there's anything wrong with having an opinion, a position, not being apolitical, not being neutral, or not being objective, as long as it's very, very clear what that positionality is. I personally think I get employed because of my positionality a lot.
Good. Daniel?
So yeah, I agree. I think we need to play a role of advocacy and sort of use our platforms for challenging those imbalances in power. And because these are political issues, it's important to empower those who have no voice, because part of the problem is that there are some very loud voices in every room that is making decisions, and it's not necessarily the people that is more affected. And I just wanted to round up, because that's what participatory methods do. That's what we're doing by using a different way of working with communities. And I'm sure that Gina has much more to say about this than I do, but perhaps they can also be useful as a way not only of working with communities and creating the knowledge with communities, but also empowering them so they can use that knowledge for advocacy and engaging in the political transport, which is something that not necessarily is done, or if it's done in many cases, it goes back to those imbalanced power relations, that there are very specific groups that are controlling the voices that are coming from certain parts of our cities.
Thank you. Winnie.
You need to be neutral. I think I would pick from Littman Todd, who argues that really we need to have a comprehensive analysis and also be neutral. So those two concepts to me capture what needs to be done, in that whatever we want to do, we have to be comprehensive about it. It's not skewed, because I think it's the skewed approach that leads us into not being neutral and also undermining, the marginalized or some groups within a city. So I think being neutral also is a very subjective.
Yeah. I don't think have me.
Thank you. SG, would you like to?
Yeah,
come in?
I think we will not just take a position. Our position must be fact-based. So once the fact speaks to us that there is inequality, that the infrastructural distribution is promoting poverty, then neutrality then becomes you are just a bystander. So what?
No.
No.
We propel our advocacy of the template is that we should have facts. And once we have facts and we are convinced that we have not conspired with our hypothesis, that this is what we want to say, and it's obvious, so we can't be neutral. Once the research findings indicated that this is inequality and iniquity, therefore, we should speak to it. So, I mean, neutrality means we will do our neutrality in our research. But once we have been able to get our facts that concludes on one way or the other, we should be able to advocate for the outcomes of our research.
Thank you. Thank you. Gina, please.
She frozen as well?
It's fair.
I know. No?
Yeah. So what I would say is, obviously, as Karen said, you cannot avoid your positionality and the way that, the reflexivity that goes with that. I think my feeling is that the best way it can work from that is through doing this peer research work, where we hopefully give people in vulnerable groups in communities the tools so that they can do the research and they can then move forward with what comes out of that work. But everybody has a positionality. This idea that you could be apolitical, I think is
Yeah, the idea that you're apolitical is itself deeply political.
I mean, I once got told, that because of the idea that you set up in physical research, you set up a hypothesis and you completely cleanly observe the thing. It's like where you choose to go and collect your seeds is objective. It's not objective. What question you ask is not objective. So no research, in my view, is neutral. Every research has got its biases.
It also comes to the way that we report our results.
Yeah.
Because if we remain completely neutral and say, these are my findings, do whatever you want with it, they can also be subversive.
Correct.
I mean, you need to take responsibility of what kind of message and what interpretation you're giving.
Absolutely. We covered quite a large set of issues today, and thank you very much for that. I think we may not have entirely cracked the question what transport research, transport planning, transport poverty is, but I do one thing that I've picked up very strongly from the discussion is that there is a need for a position piece to be written on that for clarity, and I think that is something we need to talk about how we can do that as a collective, because I think that is actually very important. The other thing I would say is that I think we agree that this is a useful thing to keep thinking about and to keep discussing, and also really needs to be embedded beyond the academics, and it's really nice to have this discussion, but we still end up talking to each other rather than to the people we actually need to talk about this topic. And I think one of the things that's come through very strongly for me is also that we need to embed this in how we teach the next generation of students and practitioners and professionals. And I think that too is something we need to think about how we can do that more proactively. So I would like to thank everyone for the discussion today, which I thought was incredibly rich and enjoyable, at least for the people here in the room.